Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to see the room has indeed filled. We never know in these days of online hybrid things and then live and back and forth who will show up. But it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Roslyn Silver 27 Science Lecture, Botany of Empire, Plant Worlds and the Scientific Legacies of Colonialism. I'm Beck Jordan Young, and I'm the interim director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this lecture with Banu Subramaniam. And before we get started, I want to thank everyone who made this event possible and go over just a few little housekeeping items. You may have noticed that at the corners when you came in, we have masks available for you. We're going to ask you, or we're going to encourage you, it's not required, but we will encourage you to wear masks today when you are not speaking or eating. We understand masking as a disability and social justice issue, and we affirm our commitment to collective care, especially in a moment when evidence-based public health practice is under attack. The masks are here available at the end of each row. You're welcome to grab them now or come along. And also before, let me do some thank yous first. The Barnard Center for Research on Women staff, I'd like to acknowledge Hope Dector, who's up here, Pam Phillips, who's not here tonight, Sandra Moyano, who's here, Sophie Kreitzberg, also not here. Some people could make it and others couldn't. Kelsey Kitsky, who's right here, and Margot Kotler, the Associate Director of BCRW, who has stepped in to do so many parts. I'm hoping Margot will be able to get back from an emergency that she had to tend to and join us in a little bit. I also want to extend profound thanks to Professor Natali Valdez here at Fordham and Fordham's Sociology and Anthropology Department for joining us as co-sponsors of this event and providing this beautiful room for us to meet in. It really is fantastic to start what I hope will be a practice of collaboration between our institutions. I also want to offer thanks to the Fordham Office of Public Programs, Facilities, and Media Services. Certainly, I want to enthusiastically thank our ASL interpreters, Janine Pollard here and Brandon Kazan-Maddox over here, who are amazing and work with us on lots of BCRW events. So thank you so much. I also want to thank Epic Catering NYC for the lovely snacks that we got. I want to mention one upcoming event for the remainder of this semester. This is the only remaining public event. We have lots of small scholarly working groups and so on that are going on, and then we'll pick up with public events in the fall. But we do have this exciting online event on May 22nd at 6 p.m. It's called You Only Get What You're Organized to Take. And that is the title of a new book by Reverend Liz Theoharis, who is at Union Theological Seminary, and her colleague Noam Sandweiss-Back. Reverend Theoharis is the co-founder with Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign. And this is a beautiful book built on decades of organizing with and for poor people around economic justice. And I think at this moment that this book offers strategies for organizing that are really, really useful for everybody who is trying to live and breathe in this world today. Next, before I really dive into the official part of the program, I want to acknowledge that this land we're standing on and the land on which this campus was built and the Barnard Columbia campus, where many of us do our work, is part of Lenapehoking. Not great at saying the word, but Lenapehoking, I believe, the traditional and unceded territory of the Lenape people of the Delaware Nation. The Lenape were displaced from their homelands to places as far as Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario, Canada. We pay respect to Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, and uplift their continuing presence on their homelands. We also acknowledge the legacy of forced displacement enslavement, and genocide of African people from their homelands. We understand that our existence on this campus, again, as well as the Barnard campus where many of us work, using the resources of these institutions has been enabled by a history of both land and labor extraction. I'd like to tether this land acknowledgement to the text we're celebrating with tonight's event, because Banu Subramaniam does so much deep thinking about the legacies of settler colonialism and coloniality in general and indigeneity. And so there's a part in the book, this is a section of chapter 2. I hope you don't mind that the first thing I'm quoting here is not your words exactly, it's words that you in turn have quoted. But Banu quotes the Indigenous scholar Leanne Simpson, who in this passage is writing about what Banu calls Banu says are histories mobilized as a potent site for the management and recuperation of white Western patriarchy. I want to just quote Simpson's words. And the question is how to tell these histories. Simpson answers, really, what the colonizers have always been trying to figure out is how do you extract natural resources from the land when the people whose territory you're on believe that those plant, animal, and minerals have both spirit and therefore agency? You use gender violence to remove indigenous peoples and their descendants from the land, remove agency from the plant and animal worlds, and you reposition Aki, the land, as, quote, natural resources for the use and betterment of white people. And I think by entering this evening through that specific quote, I hope that you understand a little bit more about why it's so crucial for us to do land acknowledgements, not as a pro forma exercise that we do at the beginning of talks, but to think about how that is connected to the knowledge production in the institutions that we live and work and teach in. So I want to ask you to hold that for a moment as I will return to the more formal introduction of content and introduction of Professor Subramaniam. I have a few community guidelines that I'd like to ask everyone to follow tonight. First, please do not record or take photos as we are recording the event and will make the video available to attendees next week. We have a YouTube channel. You'll be able to find the full recording there. I also asked that during the Q&A, everyone please only speak for 2 minutes. If you can frame a question, that would be fantastic. But even if you do have a comment, it really needs to be held to 2 minutes because we have a good sized crowd and we want to engage as many people as possible. If you go over 2 minutes, I will gently cut you off. So tonight, we are so honored to hear from Dr. Banu Subramaniam, whose work is indispensable to the field that I work in, which is feminist, intersectional science, and technology studies. And yes, our acronym is FISTS. So this is the way in which we assert the power of the knowledge that comes from bringing together critical gender studies, critical studies of power hierarchies that mesh and intersect with science to understand how science is built in and through those power structures. I'm going to say more about Banu in a moment, but first a few words about the work we're here to celebrate. In this latest book, Banu draws on fields as disparate as queer studies, Indigenous studies, and the biological sciences to explore the labyrinthine history of how colonialism transformed rich and complex plant worlds into biological knowledge. Botany of Empire, Plant Worlds, and the Scientific Legacies of Colonialism demonstrates how botany's foundational theories and practices were shaped and fortified in the aid of colonial rule and its extractive ambitions. We see how colonizers obliterated plant time's deep history to create a reductionist system that imposed a Latin-based naming system, drew on the imagined sex lives of European elites to explain plant sexuality, and discussed foreign plants like foreign humans. For those of you who have read Banu's incredible work, Ghost Stories for Darwin, and also Holy Science, the second book, these themes will be familiar to you. And it's like meeting old friends here who've grown and developed and met new friends and gotten richer. It's a beautiful, beautiful book to re-encounter both the core themes that are explored and developed in Banu's work, and also one of the beautiful methods, I think, that I love about your writing, which is that these very, in certain ways, I mean, they're all beautifully written, but more traditional chapters of history and analysis, moving through very specific and concrete aspects of how scientific fields were built, are interspersed with these playful, imaginative stories. They're fables where Banu helps us to imagine a world otherwise. And they're like beautiful science fiction fairy tales that help us to imagine what would happen in a decolonized science with a decolonized botany. Okay, so I distracted myself. Subramanian also shows us a more inclusive and capacious field of botany, untethered and decentered from its origins in histories of racism, slavery, and colonialism. Described by the Los Angeles Review of Books as, quote, a clarion call and an inspiration, this vision harnesses the power of feminist and scientific thought to chart a course for more socially just practices of experimental biology. Just a few words now about this lectureship itself. The Barnard Center for Research on Women, or BCRW, has hosted the Roslyn Silver 27 Science Lecture since 2004. At BCRW, the lecture has provided a platform for brilliant scholars and activists whose research speaks to the racialized and gendered nature of science itself, moving beyond the questions of inclusion and representation, often captured under the rubric of, quote, women in science. Rather than being women in science or women and science, what we see in the works that are highlighted and the thinkers, scholars who are highlighted in the Roslyn Silver Science Lecture is what happens when science done deeply, critically, with close attention, not in a loose way, but ever closer attention to the practices of scientists, to the material world. What happens when that meets rigorous feminist thought? And so that's what this lecture series celebrates. And there is absolutely nobody working today in the field whose work better exemplifies that tradition than Banu Subramaniam. Her work is erudite, playful, rigorous, transformative, deeply historical, and imaginative. It's always rooted in a deep, loving, close engagement with science, not an engagement at arm's length. She pulls it very, very close and does the same with the kinds of struggles and political contestation within feminist studies and gender studies. So, believe me, I'm getting close to the end of my introductory remarks. We have books for sale tonight. I want to say that now. They're over here. It's very exciting to purchase them. We'll post a QR code on the screen at the end of the event. That QR code will also give you the opportunity to make a donation to BCRW, which is a fantastic, radical space for the kind of thought you're going to participate in tonight. I'll say more about it at the end of the event. So finally, Banu Subramaniam is the Luella Lemare Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Wellesley College. As an interdisciplinary scholar, trained as an evolutionary biologist and plant scientist, she has since embraced tools for the humanities and social sciences to help shape the field of feminist science and technology studies. Really, I would say feminist intersectional science and technology studies fists. Banu is the author of 3 books. The latest, which we have tonight, Botany of Empire, Plant Worlds and the Scientific Legacies of Colonialism. Before that, Holy Science, the Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, winner of the 2020 Michelle Kendrick Memorial Book Prize from the Society of Literature, Science, and the Arts, and Ghost Stories for Darwin, the Science of Variation and the Politics of Diversity, winner of the 2016 Ludwig Fleck Prize. She's also the co-editor of Feminist Science Studies, a new generation, and meet, a transnational analysis. I will introduce Professor Valdez when we get to the panel. So right before that. So without further introduction, please help me welcome Professor Banu Subramaniam.
Thank you, Beck, for that very, very generous introduction. I feel I should shut up and, let your words speak. Can everyone hear me? Loud enough? Okay, great. BCRW, I think, has, for those of us who teach in women's and gender studies, has been like a beacon and model for such a long time of the events they hold, the journal they publish, and really their tenacity of spirit and commitment to feminist politics. And I think all of you know what is happening at Barnard campus and at Columbia. And so I speak in solidarity with the students and faculty there. I was convinced by Beck that it is important to continue to think at moments like the surreal moments that we are living through. And so I do it in that spirit. My entry into the field of women's and gender studies is perhaps an unusual one. After an undergraduate degree in India, I came to the United States for a PhD in evolutionary biology and genetics. Filled with stories of an objective, rational science, I was confident that a young student from the third world could easily follow their passions and dreams. And as the story often goes, the hallways and culture of science felt less than hospitable. Might I become part of that leaky, incontinent scientific pipeline? The pipeline is a popular metaphor where leaks represent the attrition of women, queer, and students of color. Recent projects with only some success have poured millions of dollars to pursue equity in the sciences, where the leaks are seen as the problem. What drew me to women's studies is a different analysis. The problem is not the leaks, but the pipe itself, and the structures and ideologies that celebrate pipe travel. It is feminist studies that help me understand that, contrary to my earlier beliefs, scientific culture was not the culture of no culture. Rather, categories of gender, race, class, sexuality, nation were everywhere, constantly shaping science and scientific knowledge. Structures within and outside science help reproduce both gender and science with remarkable consistency. For me, this humanistic understanding of science, scientific culture, and its knowledge production proved liberating. Rather than leave the sciences, women's studies gave me the tools to understand my experiences in the hallways of science and renewed my passion for science, for thinking and doing biology. I completed a PhD in biology and a graduate certificate in women's studies and set forth on an interdisciplinary adventure of work across biology and feminism. I want to start with two key lessons I feel I've learned in this journey. First, that essentialist ideas of binary sex and the role of men and women remain remarkably resilient. The key architects of the current administration's education plan in higher education that sees current higher education as a gynocracy, where women are wrongly encouraged into STEM fields, instead of supporting men through their feminine goals of homemaking, which is what undergraduate education ought to be for women. Our fertilization president is considering models of increasing the birth rate, including rewarding scientists who marry and have children. As Feminist Science STS has always taught us, here we go again. Second, the idea that biology is remarkably consistent across species. Plant biology has remarkable resemblance to human biology. Years ago, I might have agreed that plants are an odd focus to revisit histories of colonialism. But this recent book that Beck talked about really astonished me. Understanding plant worlds through history reveals how central plants were to colonialism and vice versa. The history of colonial botany is a story about more than plant worlds, how plants, animals, and colonized humans were used by and for the colonial project. And what we see repeatedly is on the one hand, ideas about colonial, the colonists and humans imagined through their lives were anthropomorphized into the non-human world. And then once we looked at the non-human world and saw the same characteristics that we see of humans in the non-human world, it naturalized what we see as human biology. And so part of what biology does is create this idea of the natural and the biological as universal. Centering the plant, we see how colonists remade plants in their image for their need, consumption, profit, and for empire. But first, let us ask, what did colonizers do to the land and its inhabitants? And here was the quote of Leanne Simpson that Beck used. Really, what the colonizers have always been trying to do is how do you extract natural resources from the land when the peoples whose territory you're on believe that those plant, animal, and minerals have both spirit and therefore agency? And she answers in three. You use gender violence to remove indigenous people from the land, you remove agency from plant and animal worlds, and you reposition the land as natural resources for the use and betterment of white people. Colonialism is fundamentally a story of violence, a teeming, inventive life on earth decimated, cleaved into hierarchies of human and non-human, superior and inferior, master and slave, native and alien. A vibrant, vital planet rendered into desolate landscapes of crashed and crushed earth. An ecological apocalypse of pillaged lands and peoples through slavery and empire. I depart from the usual debates of the two cultures, a story where the humanities and sciences, once separated, are brought together and anew through science and technology studies. So much of STS remains grounded in internal histories of the West and the biosciences. What is forgotten are lost genealogies, the erasure of women of color, indigenous, post-colonial, diasporic, crip, and queer feminists, who have always written more syncretic, symbiotic stories that do not privilege the human. The power and enduring legacy of colonialism is best captured by the term coloniality. As Edward Glisson argues, West is not a place, it is a project. Colonialism wasn't a historical blip or moment in history, but an enduring installation, an infrastructure of coloniality, epistemologies, methodologies, and methods. Drawing on Aníbal Quijano's work on the coloniality of power, Maria Lugones hones in on its central critical foundation, the modern colonial gender system. Coloniality's infrastructure, grounded on race and gender, erased and marginalized other models of social organization and myriad local systems of knowing the world over. One of the key insights of feminist work on the sciences is that even though nature is consistently gendered female, so such as Mother Nature, biology has persistently shaped the workings of nature as masculine and patriarchal, nature red in tooth and claw. The rise of botany transposed colonial views of binary sex and gender, compulsory heterosexuality, and Eurocentrism onto nature. No surprise then that there is more scientific work on competition than on cooperation, more on conflict than on coexistence, more on battle between the sexes than on joyful cooperative living. Colonial worldviews still undergird biological thought. In the afterlives of empire, how do we challenge colonial theories of biology, examine and critique their foundations to reimagine plant lives anew? Toni Morrison develops an evocative concept in the novel Beloved, rememory, a term she uses as both a verb and a noun, a haunting memorial of what has been excluded, excised, and evicted. Rememory, as Vivian Salehana argues, is preserved in institutions, branded upon their violently structured bureaucracy, and practiced upon the bodies of the colonized, by the bodies of the colonizers. The past is not merely the past, but a place to make deeper discoveries, as satisfying as they are disturbing, reaffirming our shared humanity. In Morrison, ghosts do not return. They are imminent to space. Remembering thus opens up the past, lessons of care that violent legacies of colonialism have erased, invisibilized. Remembering opens up textures of lost memories in the flesh and the sinew, in the pores of the living and the dead, the ghostly afterlives of Malthus, Darwin, and Linnaeus, in restored tales of life on Earth. In tracing the coloniality of botany, in 3 acts, I explore the stakes, the importance, and the possibility of thinking against empire. Act 1. Growing up in India, the plant world was forever enchanted. Plants, their roots, shoots, leaves, and flowers were woven into mythological and folk tales. Never immobile and intelligent beings, plants were active agents in fantastical stories of my childhood. Plants housed transmigrated souls of the divine, human, and other sentient beings. The sweet jasmine emerged from the churning of the ocean of milk. The tamarind tree and its sour fruit was always home to a myriad spirits. The sesame tree emerged when Lord Vishnu's sweat fell on earth. Plants were essential and ubiquitous as digestives, health aids, beauty remedies, games, and musical instruments. Once I entered school, a botanical education disenchanted the natural world. Latin names I had to learn by rote erased the luxurious and magical context of my childhood. They severed plants from the world I lived and knew, a world in alien tongue. During my botanical education, its universal terminology seemed sterile, abstract, absolute, and without context. A study in botany and its Latin nomenclature was a study in alienation from the natural world around me. As Jamaica Kincaid argues, this naming of things is so crucial to possession, a spiritual padlock with the key thrown irretrievably away, that it is a murder and erasing. We need new vocabularies and new languages for any project of decolonizing botany. Act 2. Invasion biology emerged as a new subfield in the 1980s, and it has exploded since. By definition, invasive species are foreign. We have seen a resurgence of xenophobic alarm from the political right and the left, from environmentalists and non-environmentalists alike, a veritable well-funded industry of bioinvasion, academic, policy-oriented, and activist. The idea of invasion biology is predicated on a binary view of the world, nature in place and out of place. Deeply racialized invasion biology stokes xenophobic alarm of a world increasingly out of place. Cultural theorists argue that this recent hyperbole about alien species is best understood as a cultural panic about changing racial, economic, and gender norms in the nation. The perceived globalization of markets continues to be interpreted by elements of both the right and the left as a problem of immigration. Thus, immigrants and foreigners, products of the global, are perceived as one of the key reasons for problems in the local, and indeed, we're living through one such moment right now. Remembering invasion biology through the histories of empire reveals a profound and deliberate biological amnesia. Empire was an extractive economy where colonists went, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, and viruses went along. Imperialism is fundamentally an ecological project. In the early modern period, botany was big science and big business, critical to Europe's ambitions as a colonial trader. Colonialism ushered a massive and grand reshuffling of global biota. It would be more accurate to characterize colonial expansion as the original bioinvasion. One can and should understand the installing of the biological sciences as the universal abstract and expert knowledge as a significant legacy in the afterlives of empire. Thinking contemporary invasion biology alongside colonial botany reveals stark colonial racial logics. During colonial rule, there was a laissez-faire attitude and unlimited mobility across borders. For example, in the 19th and 20th century, USDA sent scientists across the globe to find interesting, tasty, funny-looking, economically important, or interesting species from across the globe. So a scientist like David Fairchild, one person, brought over 200,000 species of foreign species into the country, and there were many other scientists who did the same. The American Acclimatization Society, someone thought, why don't we introduce every bird named in Shakespeare's plays into New York Central Park? So they did. And so this really was a different moment where there were open borders and plants were moved around. And of course, colonialism fundamentally was about taking spices from this place, trying to grow them in other places, creating plantations across the board. So really, it was a moment, thinking botanically, where plants were moved willy-nilly across the globe. And that legacy of what happened during European colonialism lives on today. So if you look at naturalized alien flora in formerly colonized nations, they betray the colonists in power. So the Spanish colonies look very similar, the British very similar, right? And so our pathologizing invasive species and foreign species today, given this legacy of colonialism, seems particularly ironic. And of course, part of what happened was that as colonized countries were getting independent and developing their own independence movements and their own governments, you begin to see Western nations create borders and on who can come and who cannot come. And so in the US, you see the Chinese Exclusion Act, and this Chinese Exclusion Act is 1 year after states' quarantine law. So again, it's a very nature cultural history. When we forbid foreign plants and animals, we forbid foreign humans. And then, of course, in 1924, you see a limit to the entry of all European immigrant groups. To give you a taste of how we talk about invasive species, this is a children's book about exotic invaders infesting America. We start very, very young in how we pathologize foreign species. The idea of tinkering with Eden, that there was an Eden before, and this is a wonderful book about exotics, and the ways in which we talk about exotic species changing this Edenic, glorious past to a country filled with exotics in America. The language of invasion and warriors, of the ways in which we deal with plant species, is the language of a very militarized account. And fundamentally, the problem of bioinvasion is a borderless world. And so what we need to do is protect our borders. And all the language of national security comes into the biological as we think about biosecurity. I've been tracking, titles of the ways in which we talk about invasive species. And for me, as I've been looking, what is striking in all of these titles is not a single one is telling you that this is about a foreign plant or animal. None of these are actually about humans. But what these headlines do is that classic fear of the outsider. So whichever foreigner you're talking about, the headline causes alarm. And when you look at how we talk about foreign plants and foreign humans, they're very, very similar, that they're unhygienic, that they look visibly foreign, they're taking over everything, they're indestructible. The classic oversexed female and the fear of the third world, that they are aggressive reproducers and that they cause irreversible damage. One of my favorite titles is They Came, They Bred, They Conquered. And this cartoon is about kudzu. And if you look at the history of kudzu, kudzu first made its appearance in the US in 1882 in the World's Fair in Philadelphia. And at that time, the USDA was really worried about soil erosion. And they were looking for a plant that might help prevent soil erosion. And kudzu seemed like a wonderful prospect. It had a good root system. It was nitrogen fixing, and they thought this would be a great solution. So they paid farmers per hectare to plant kudzu. But of course, kudzu, like the southeastern United States, very much, right? And grew. And so now today we vilify it with lots of different evil monikers, my plant, or lots of such phrases. But in fact, it was an invited invasion. And again, with so many invasive species, if you look at their nature cultural histories, humans brought them here, humans created the conditions for them to grow, and then now we vilify them as individual species that are evil or bad. And in our current moment, this continues on. with the president telling the governor of Whitmer that he will save Lake Michigan from the invasive carp. The invasive carp was brought into the US as a worker fish to clean the Great Lakes by eating the algae. And then, of course, it took over. It so happens that Asian carp is overfished in China and is a delicacy there. So now there's a company that catches Asian carp in the Great Lakes and then ships it to China. Some of this is also maybe we need to evolve our culinary habits as the plants and animals around us change. And at the same time as we are going to save Lake Michigan, we are also changing what we mean by harm in terms of diluting the Endangered Species Acts. And so much of the world, the natural world, is shaped by these global and national politics. By this, I am not suggesting that there isn't damage to the natural world. What I am suggesting is that invasive species are a symptom of much deeper ecological problems in the world, the kind of overdevelopment that we do, the consistent focus on growth as opposed to thinking about our natural world. And so foreigners become easy scapegoats for a problem that is much, much deeper. And spending every weekend going around pulling invasive species is not going to solve the problem of invasive species. We need much more systemic analysis. And of course, what is poignant in all of this is who the native are in invasive species rhetoric. The natives are the white settlers, not the indigenous people. And so here again, the reworking of who a native is in this invasive species rhetoric is particularly poignant. Botany needs new nature cultural imaginations to reckon with the amnesia that consumes it. We cannot be ahistorical and ground our lives in an originary politics of white purity, litmus tests of plant origins, landscape restorations to a mythic past, and a celebration of native seeds without protecting native lands, peoples, cultures, and their habitats. Act 3. If race and nation emerge front and center in the case of biogeography, sexuality emerges as a critical node in reproductive biology. The innovation of sexual reproduction is most often posited as an evolutionary adaptation for the production of variation, the selective terrain and playground for natural selection. The coloniality of gender in botany forces us to understand how human sexual biology is not only indebted to frameworks of the natural, but also how scientific knowledge was founded on the twinned binaries of sexual difference and racial difference. Londa Schiebinger opens her book, Nature's Body, with hermaphroditic plants castrated by unnatural mothers, trees and shrubs clothed in wedding gowns, flowers spread as nuptial beds for a verdant groom and his cherished bride. Are these the memoirs of an 18th century Academy of Science or tales from the boudoir? And she argues both. Schiebinger reveals that the categories Carl Linnaeus used for a scientific classification that was both abstract and universal, and Linnaeus gave primacy to plant sexuality, and his scientization of botany coincided with an ardent sexualization of plants. She argues that the scientific revolution and the revolution in sexuality and gender came together to elevate plant sexuality as a critical focus of botany. As Janet Brown argues, to be a Linnaeus taxonomist was to believe in the sex lives of flowers. And part of what Linnaeus did is, rather than using old terminology of stamens and pistils, introduce the marriage of plants, and so the language of husbands and wives. And so his key to the sexual system was on the nuptiae plantarum or the marriage of plants. And so he imagined the flower pots as an exact analogy to human parts. So if there was a human genital part, there was an equivalent in plants. But of course, plants do lots of interesting things. And so we have had to invent lots of vocabularies to accommodate what plants do. So if they have only male flowers, they are androecious. Only female flowers, they're gynoecious. They can be androdioecious, gynodioecious, androgynomonoecious, andromonoecious, gynomonoecious, polygamomonoecious, subdioecious, trimonoecious, trioecious, and I could go on. But I think you get the picture. The proliferation of terms is to accommodate a world of seemingly infinite and imaginative plant variation into the limited vocabulary of European sexualites. And we see this, of what it is nature does is, again, what is happening at the current moment of why NPR and, PBS got money because they claim that banana slugs are hermaphrodites, or that there are queer animals, right? That this becomes a way in which to dismantle the ways in which we think about plants and animals. And fundamentally, the argument in biology is not that male and female exist, but that these are functional definitions. The larger cell is always considered female, and individuals that produce the smaller cells are considered male. And again, we see that in the executive order. So that same old biological argument we begin to see again and again in many different places. Remembering opens up the past. How academic disciplines and subdisciplines developed and consolidated through colonialism have produced structures of coloniality, nomenclatures, taxonomies, epistemologies, ontologies, methodologies, and methods sanctified by Enlightenment logics. No surprise that the original colonial bioinvasion is followed by the science of invasion biology, that the Linnaean marriage of plants produced modern reproductive biology, and colonial taxonomy laid the conditions for modern biopiracy. In Ghost Stories for Darwin, I confronted the figures of the abject ghosts of scientific reason and racism. Rather than repel with horror or silence, I engaged the ghosts to understand a history long repressed. Having confronted these colonial, eugenic, racist, and misogynist histories, I can now see past the fading specters of Darwin, Linnaeus, and Malthus. I see other ghosts, enchanted ghosts, the lively ghosts of a vibrant and vital botanical past. The task before us is a renewed imagination, remembering the many paths not taken, the many futures that were once possible. To be sure, there is no purity, no Eden to return to, but exuberant, enchanted, teeming landscapes of radical botany, queer botanical worlds teeming with anticipation and promise. Let us liberate them. Thank you.
Wonderful. Clear content in here. Well, we're moving back up here for a little bit of a panel discussion. I'll just say we're going to have a few minutes of a panel discussion, and then we're going to open it up for a little bit of time for a discussion with the audience. Before I should come over here for the recording probably, although I do think that we have microphones in this room that pick up, but I want to make sure that my introduction of Professor Valdez is caught. Hold on. There we go. Okay, to get into the recording, the Zoom, we will have to speak into microphones on the panel. Okay. So before the panel, we're joined by Professor Natali Valdez, an assistant professor in sociology and anthropology at Fordham University. As a medical anthropologist and science and technology scholar, Valdez applies a feminist and critical race approach to understanding reproductive medicine, science, and technology. Her award-winning book, which I cannot recommend highly enough, it's terrific, you should all read it, Weighing the Future, examines the clinical translation of epigenetics and is the first ethnography of ongoing pregnancy trials in the US and the UK. Her second book project, Families in the Body, Narratives of Generational Trauma and Healing, examines how experts, patients, and the broader public draw on notions of epigenetic inheritance and trauma to explain why we get sick and how to feel better. It's going to be pretty exciting too. I said nobody should introduce me tonight, but let me say one thing about my work, which is that I am by training a socio-medical scientist. I have a kind of radically interdisciplinary training and came to, thank you. Is it on? I think it probably is not. Let's see.
There you go. So I came to my work in feminist intersectional science and technology studies by working in parallel with a cultural anthropologist and an interdisciplinary team that included a developmental and genetic neuroscientist, a psychologist whose specialty was psychometric theory, and a couple of other people who did, public health research. So we have a really interdisciplinary set of trainings and skills here, and I'm excited about that. Natali, I'm going to ask you to open up our panel with the first question, or some questions, if you would.
Well, thank you so much. I feel so incredibly honored to be here today, and I'm very, very excited that we were able to pull this off and give Banu a platform to share her research, because in the context in which ideas are being shut down, it was really important to find some space and share resources and support to make this possible. So I'm really happy that we did make this possible. And so I mean, I just want to say thank you so much to both of you. I feel like I have arrived to be sitting at the table with two giants in the field of feminist STS. Both of you have shaped my intellectual projects in various ways.
You are.
Absolutely right.
But I really want to thank you for your friendship and collegiality, and welcoming me through lots of different spaces in my career. So I think Beck, you did such a great introduction, and I'm going to situate myself in that way. But I'll just start off kind of my comments and questions with an intersection of my work with a lot of the themes that you bring up. So in my book, Weighing the Future, I make the case that science and how we translate and imagine it is a reproductive project that requires anthropological and feminist vigilance. And I think about time, but I am really trying to thwart this desire towards the future. So Weighing the Future is really trying to redirect our attention away from fixating on a future at risk, but really attending to the present, the here and now, and what is at stake now. And as your work brings to us, is that this temporality of the past is not in the past, and so the now is full of these moments from the past. And I think that your work really intersects with a lot of the ways that I think about reproduction, temporality, and the hauntings and inheritances of impure and ambivalent legacies. So I have a lot of questions, but I'll focus on three main themes. The first is your methods and the way that you read and the way that you write. The second is, and there are many different interventions that you offer us in the text, but I really loved the provocation of impurity, and particularly the way that you draw on Kincaid's work to think about critical ambivalences. And then the last, and I think we'll probably open it up and talk about this more, but the manifesto that you provide us at the very end with very concrete kind of policy-oriented approaches that we can take in hand and think about operationalizing. So on writing, reading, and your questions of method, you are promiscuous and capacious in the way that you read, and your citational politics are enacting feminist politics in a real rigorous kind of way. And so you closely read and show us through your references this field of STS and the contributors and interventions. It's great text to learn from the field itself. And I think it's also a really good kind of archive for thinking about how to read in an age of ChatGPT, what do we mean when we want to read people? What is this kind of care that we implement when we read one another's work and we read closely and we reference their words and we cite them and we say their names? I think it's going to become a practice of care, and you are emblematic of how to do that. And you, in relation to your writing, as Beck had mentioned in your introduction, you're drawing on scholarly articles and essays, autobiography, manifestos, fables, and fictions, and you share so much of yourself in an experimental way. You're experimenting, and we're kind of along for the ride, thinking about how to bring in these different fields and ideas of, literary criticism alongside botany, implementing ideas of rememory into biology. And so I kind of want to hear a little bit about your methods and writing and how you kind of came about doing it. What was it? What was the impetus around wanting to read this way, wanting to write this way, and wanting to be so unruly, basically, in the way that you are writing? And then I have another question on your intervention of impurity, but we can start with that.
Thank you. And it's always a difficult question because at some way I feel I just do it. That it's not really planned. And I think, no. I think one of the first lessons I learned in feminist studies is genre matters. That genres allow you to say some things and not say some things. So a sociology paper will allow you to do some things, and a literary paper will do something else. So I've always, when I want to write a chapter or a paper, the first thing I do is, these are the ideas I want to communicate. How do I best communicate it? Right? And sometimes fiction works well, sometimes autobiography works well. So some of it is really about taking the project of writing and the audience seriously, and then doing what I need to do to, make the arguments that I want to make. I think that's probably unsatisfying.
I want to bring you back to something that Natali said to get you to actually talk to us about your citational practice. Talk to us about how your citational practice is indebted to feminist scholarship in a way that is very different from what you would be taught as a traditional botanist. And also perhaps how the things that you want to cite, even that part of how you tell a story, also determines where you can write. Like how citational practice isn't just attached to our own disciplinary trajectories, but it's attached to what we're allowed to say and what kinds of outlets. There are things that I want to write that scientific journals, for some purposes that I want to write in, will not allow me to cite those materials. So I would love to hear your thinking on that and how you've developed it.
I think some of this is, so I was, in India, thanks to the British, when you, in 10th grade, you pick science, arts, commerce, and then, the next stage you pick which sciences. So I had never taken a course in sociology or anthropology or any of those fields. And so halfway through graduate school, when I was feeling very alienated, and I approached women's studies, and they said, this is such a common story, there's a whole literature, why don't you read? And but it was eye-opening. And some of the alienation I felt is because I had no language of culture in graduate school. Right? Like I spoke English pretty well, everyone understood me, then why was I feeling so alienated? But just understanding very basic ideas of what friendship means. It means something so different here than what I grew up with, where you would just wander to your neighbor's house without calling them for an appointment, and here I felt, okay, I don't have friends. And so then once you get a language of culture, you understand how to translate that. And I think the same thing about disciplinarity. Once I was freed from having to just write in the mode of science, who's going to stop me? Let's do everything. Let's have fun with it. Let's take the question of, genre really seriously. And to me, so some of the pieces that appear in some of the books have gotten about 10 or 15 rejections from journals. Journals are the most conservative places in any field. They do very serious gatekeeping of genres, what you can say, how can you say it. And when I went up for tenure, I didn't have a book. And because I was in a field like women's and gender studies, we're interdisciplinary, you can do it through papers. And when I was more senior, someone said, you're in a College of Humanities and Fine Arts, you should write a book. It's like, okay. And I had read many books until then, but I did not understand the power of what a book could do. In that you have individual chapters, but a book allows you to make a meta argument that brings all these little arguments into something much huge. And now I'm completely in love with that form. But books, you can, they're much more forgiving as a genre of writing, and where you can be very promiscuous. And so I think it is about where you publish. I think you cannot do things purely in journals, versus books, I think, allow you to create something of your own.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to this, but I want to hear Natalie's next question. I want to return to this.
It's pretty brief, gonna throw it back to you, but your interventions on decoloniality and the embrace of impurity are connected to your methods. And you write in chapter 9, quote, in this context, a promiscuous, polymorphous, interdisciplinary methodological approach is precisely what we need to remind us that we are impure beings, impure nations with impure histories and genealogies. We should revel in impurity, embrace it as essential to our politics as methodologies and method. So what does it feel like to be impure to you?
Why impurity?
Just because I think invasion biology is so much about a purity politics. I think the ways in which we are talking about binary sex is so much about purity politics. There are only these categories available. And I think anyone who has lived as an immigrant in any country understands the kind of nationalism that has emerged both in the US and in India is about purity politics. So I think there's something about purity and impurity that is very much of our times. And so it just seems really important it felt useful to think about it in those terms.
Oh, wow. This from, okay, here, I'll use this one.
Okay, now I have a whole different line. I want to come back. I want to say one quick thing about books, but I want to come back also to impurity. One of the things that I think has happened in decades of incredible, really materially and analytically rich feminist scholarship on the workings of science and on not just how science is practiced, but through analyzing deeply how science is practiced, really re-examining what kinds of facts are massaged into existence and lovingly tended and nurtured over time, and what ones are absolutely refused and disallowed. And genre has some role in that, and that is that anything that we publish in our books becomes inadmissible as a citation in many, many scientific journals. They want to cite scientific journals very often, and it's quite rare that they will cite books, especially books that do have this promiscuous, unbounded material in it. So I just wanted to flag that because it's connected to something I hoped we would talk about a little tonight, which is the gatekeeping of knowledge and the remarkable fact that so much of the brilliant work that you have done, I think of so many other people and Fausto Sterling as a really tremendous example, Sarah Richardson, Nellie Outshorn, who has done amazing histories of endocrinology, and many, many others, really could shake the absolute foundations of the fields if they were read by people in those fields. And every now and then there are young scholars in the fields who are encountering them and trying to find ways to get the work in. But the disciplines, the science disciplines are very, very resistant. And I periodically find cycles of my gender studies students as being not quite as resistant, but scared to go deeply into the scientific material, feeling like it doesn't belong to them, like they need to know more than they do to go into it. And I wonder if you currently have thoughts and ideas about, instead of just doing things the way that we've been doing, do you have ideas about how to maybe create more promiscuity between the disciplines, break that down more? Maybe both of you, what are you doing with your own teaching, with your own students and writing that you think in part is addressing this? Because I know you both work in that place.
Sure. I don't know if there are any good ideas, but I think we should start. Our project is not convincing the sciences.
Yeah.
That is not our project, right? And so I think we have to reframe the mission of women's and gender studies as a truly interdisciplinary field where the natural sciences, math, engineering have a place.
Yeah.
And we need labs of our own. We need experiments of our own. And I think we need to start producing this knowledge.
Yes.
We've waited for 40 years trying to convince people on other parts of campus. And I think there are many, in my experience, many scientists who are completely on board.
Mm-hmm.
But as you said, it's hard to cite us. Their currency to get tenure and promotion is about grants. They have to get grants, although not anymore from NSF and NIH. There are some things that are happening right now that are really interesting, that are taking down some of those challenges. We'll see where these things play out. But for them to get tenure and on their parts of campus, it's a different game. So it is structurally set up for this not to happen. But in my experience, there are lots of scientists who are resistant, but also many who, will work with us, but they may not be rewarded with us. So my thing has been to collaborate with those who will collaborate, work with those students who want to take on. So I have, for example, a project with Madeline Bartlett, who is a congeneticist, rethinking the language of plant sex and gender, and basically arguing we should throw these terms, that they don't make sense with respect to plant biology. I'm working with landscape ecologists of how we might reframe how we think about landscape ecology and invasive species. How might we find? And the first thing people will say, biologists will say, I agree with you. Tell me another word I can use, right? And it's like, the problem is not just the word. The problem is the foundation that we will only see the world as native or foreign, right? So we need other vocabularies that I would say drawn from plant biology, of the life histories of characteristics that can tell us something about their ecological futures, rather than a litmus test of where they grew up. So I sort of feel we should keep doing what we're doing, and our focus should be about building an agenda for feminist studies that takes the natural sciences as our playground, as our intellectual foundation. And
I'll just briefly kind of bring some threads together and then want to open it up for conversation. But there's a few things that are kind of emerging, coalescing in my mind, and conversation that we just had before this panel. But you were talking about, and I wanted to just bring it back to the manifesto that you had at the end of the book around the need that producing an abolitionist science, which you're proposing at the end of the book, it requires a political context of democracy, so that there is a sense that science still has some connection, intimate connection to democracy that you're calling for is fundamental for an abolition science, that you want to prepare for, that you want to create these labs for. And I'm thinking about this as like feminist STS has a vital role for thinking about the making of science and remaking of science over and over again. That is akin to some of the conversations that I've been hearing in other spheres. I went to Saidiya Hartman's talk yesterday, and her words are ringing in my ears. But she was saying, why are we fighting for DEI when it was an anemic concept already? Black studies didn't want anything to do with it. So, and we're going to continue to do this work regardless of whether or not we exist formally, institutionally recognized or not. And I do think that there's a parallel to draw around women's and gender studies, feminist STS, has a role to play in thinking about the ideas of science, either its dismantling and the impure and critical ambivalence that we might have with the dismantling of science. That it could be made anew, and that there are potentially possibilities, and that this modern science from the Enlightenment is an anemic form, but not one that would position us as anti-science in the conservative sense, which is a nuance that we have to carefully delineate. But I think, what do you see? You were saying, like earlier, you said we need to prepare ourselves. And I wonder if you have ideas for how you want to prepare ourselves for remaking science.
I think some of it for me is what so in my education, I never learned any history. And I think it's such a tragedy. And some of looking at the history of botany, there are lots of great ideas right through that of people who didn't think of it as the marriage of plants, right? Who had other kinds of imaginations. So some of it, I think, is also just going back to our histories, and this idea of rememory is serious, that there are other ideas. And similarly, if you look, rememory the history of DEI, it was a far more radical politics of, what does it mean for all of us to live together in particular kinds of ways. And I think the other thing that also seems clear is that facts are not going to convince anybody, right? It's never that facts are also taken through certain ideological filters. And so I think sometimes we just want to produce better data as though better data is going to convince people. And I think this is what feminist STS teaches us so well, that those contexts become so important, and that why people believe what they do. And so sometimes to me, I find these, March for Science becomes too narrow a frame of what the problem is with the world. And I think in that sense, feminist STS, I think, gives us much richer frameworks. And I think part of what I was thinking also, what we were talking about earlier, is to examine seriously why certain projects failed. And I would, I think you're absolutely right. In part, DEI failed because it was an anemic project, right? That the politics was diluted into a kind of check boxes of various things. And the radical possibilities of living together in a world with many different kinds of people was lost in the ways in which DEI projects enacted it. And so understanding those failures and going back to the original ideas that, gave birth to these projects becomes really important. All the while, one of the lessons to me has been, I don't know if, I suspect some people would say it's neoliberalism, that its ability to domesticate and depoliticize, that has been extraordinary. Exactly. It's been so, like every terminology that has been come up has been taken up in some kind of way where the original idea wasn't there. And for us to understand why and how did that happen, and how might we, find other ways in which to talk about it, and the ways in which, what kinds of communities do we need to build for that kinds of politics. So I think it forces us into a different kind of analysis, I would say.
Beautiful. Okay.
I am going to resist engaging with this, which I want to so much, but I want even more than that. I want to invite you to engage. So are there questions, comments that people would like to make ideally? Okay, here we go. I'm going to bring you a microphone. I think the mic might pick up, but it might not.
I think, like you said, I think you need it for the Zoom recording. Hi, I'm Hillary Callahan. I'm actually a botanist. And I'm so thrilled now. I just got a hard copy of this book, which means maybe I'll continue reading it. And I've been so enjoying this book, as well as your two previous books. And what I want to ask you about, I think it's related to rememory, but my question kind of is this related to me, which is the idea of perenniality, right? So in botany, this idea, I think a lot of us think of plants as small and, you grow them for one season. It's really the minority of plants that do that. And, we know about trees, but there's all these other ways that plants live again and again and again. And part of it has to do with being, the cycling of it, the alternation between being hidden and being bold, is in plants. And I see it also, in your books, that I'm kind of like, how come Banu hasn't written a book lately, right? And then it finally comes out and it's so exciting. And it's so familiar, and yet it lives again. So I'm just kind of curious if you can comment on that concept, and if it's in this book. I haven't gotten there yet. And I think it's a really important idea. It's kind of a question about not just memory, but time.
Thank you.
Okay. I think this is one of the things when Madeline Bartlett and I've been talking about, really, that plants, sex, gender, when you use it, it is not homologous with human sex and gender. And in part, alternation of generation is so.
Not everything.
And it's not, that's absolutely right. Absolutely right. But that even if you're just looking at that cycle, that it is a very different mode. And I think I do some of it, I think not enough, is the question of time is so different when you look at the plant world through human lenses. Of what constitutes a general, where some plants live so much longer, some are almost ephemeral. And so I think plants, the diversity of what plants do is, I do not have enough vocabulary to capture it in our impoverished lives. And you should also write more, Hillary. Conversations are always wonderful.
Great.
Thanks so much. This was, oh, sure. I have something stuck. Sorry.
Okay.
One sec. Gonna bug me. Hi, I'm Pat. I'm a MD PhD student at Rutgers. Thank you so much for this talk. It was so interesting, and just the conversation has been so enriching. And I had two questions for you. One was back to this question of genre. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but to hear that there's fiction in it is so interesting to me. And I guess you mentioned how important genre is. So my question is, like, what does fiction allow you to do that your other forms of writing don't? And I'm also interested, like, how did you get started writing fiction? Like, that's not necessarily something everyone's doing. And why do you think it's particularly suited to a feminist STS project? And then I have, like, just another question about, like, as an MD PhD student getting trained in gender studies, like, do you have any advice for, like, a young scholar navigating these, like, two really disparate fields?
So when I was in grad school, they invited me to be on a panel of North Carolina higher ed administrators. And the wife of the chair of my department was an administrator. So I knew she would be in the audience. And it was about talking about grad school and my experiences as a student. So I did not want to compromise what I said, but the point was never about these people, right? It's always about structural. So I think I wrote my first piece of fiction, which was called Snow Brown and the Seven Detergents. And so it was, through using that fairy tale as a way to talk about how the image of the ideal scientist is so very particular, that of this character who had to wash off parts of herself. So that was the first time where I felt I got my point across, without having to name names. And it gave me that power. And that part of what fiction allows you to do is to take any scale, right? You can talk of the small, you can talk about the big, and it allows you to connect all different things that would take many books to do. But it's that big picture that I feel feminist SDS has really allowed me to see, right? About the ways in which these same ideas work at so many scales. And I think fiction is a wonderful way in which to do that. So some of my fiction is very deliberate in that I know what I want to say before I start, but in the last couple books I've been trying, and it's frightening because you start writing a story without necessarily having it laid out. Normally when I write, I kind of I know what I'm going to do. But in fiction, sometimes the story just takes you. The characters take you in ways that are kind of scary, but also exhilarating. That you don't know when you're starting where the story is going to go, and it can go in lots of different ways. So it's a very different way for me of thinking and writing, where you really get into it and you get sucked into the story as it's unfolding. So it's an interesting exercise. God, that advice is a hard one, all right? And in part because I think we are all different. We all have, and you're living in very different times as well in terms of what's, and I think all have a different tolerance for different experiences. So I think it's really important to be happy. A life full of angst is, if it's possible to be avoided, it should be avoided. And so for me, it has really always been about reading what is possible and not, and kind of pushing at the limits of that, but not getting so outside of it, you'll get written off. And depending on which community you're on, that is very different. But I think you can still do a lot of personal writing and getting those ideas out. So once you have tenure, then you can get out into the world. I think it's really important to find allies, and they are now they can be anywhere in the world. To me, you've been so important at different points to be able to call someone up, and because there may not be someone within your department who understands what you're trying to do, but people elsewhere do. And at some point for me, ironically, all the interdisciplinary work that I do is what has propelled my career. I think had I been conservative and just kept doing, biology in ways that made no sense to me, I don't think it would have been, certainly not as fun, but probably not as rich a career either. So it's, you should know that.
I definitely want to add, and I want to say that in all of Banu's work, you don't know this if you haven't read it yet, but interdisciplinarity is a core method. And it's a core method in our field, but it's also, it's a really, really exciting method when you insist upon it as not different fields meeting, but really woven through each other. And history is always one of the disciplines that's there. That's so crucial. I also would just say there's an amazing network. There are actually two different networks out there of MD, PhD folks who are bringing in both, bringing in all kinds of really structural thinking and social scholarship and humanities of a variety of sorts into trying to bring it into the pillars. They call it the pillars of medical education. So you can, if you're interested in that, contact me and I'll hook you up with those people. And I'll pass that to Natali. Thanks to you.
Well, any
Other-
a question back?
Yeah, oh, good, great. Let me pass it, Kelsey. Thank you.
Is there a question back here still?
I thought there was a hand. No? Okay, here we go.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Asif. I teach at Fordham. I'm a historian of science. I thank you so much for the talk. This was, and all of the conversation. This was really fantastic and so inspiring, particularly the interdisciplinarity and the ways in which I think, Beck, you were talking about the way it's really baked into it. It's not superficial. But my question is actually something else, which was thinking about the ways in which, to the extent that modern science exists to me at least, modern science exists largely in a hyper-capitalist context. And so there's a kind of the deep embedded in it is the project of extraction and in all its manifestations. So I was wondering, where does capital or capitalism fit into your story, in the sense that you have a very beautiful sort of schematic of coloniality, but I wonder to what degree does, for example, in your understanding, scientific taxonomies and genealogies also depend quite significantly, or not, in your opinion, on capital modes of extraction, and those kinds of epistemologies also influence and inflect our understanding of all of this. Thank you.
I'm gonna leave it with you.
It's about it all, right?
Yeah.
Extraction is at the heart of empire.
Mhm.
And so I think, like, why did we need a universal naming of plants, right? In part, it is to aid that extractive empire, that we know the nutmeg here is the nutmeg there. And so I think part of the argument of the book is that extractive mode of colonialism has shaped all of botany. Similarly, why was it okay for them to move plants around, but now we use this rhetoric of invasive species? So I would say it is you're absolutely right. I think it is at the heart of everything, and it continues to be, right? We are still caught up we still use the same terminology. We are still caught up in those same frameworks. And so some of it is about, and in all of this, at the heart of it is that Leanne Simpson quote that Beck Beck quoted in the beginning, is that it's a vision where humans are outside of nature, right? So then nature can become a thing we talk about, we can extract, it is ours to do what with. And so part of the alternate imaginations is always humans within nature, right? Of how do we live together? They are not there for our beckoning, they live with us. And we need to figure out how we create a world together where extraction becomes very difficult as a mode of living together.
You say it.
I'm not going
I need to.
retell you.
I know.
When I was thinking about the question is great, and I think you could write a whole book about capitalism without using the word capitalism and think through the lens of coloniality, which I think was interesting, coloniality and extraction. But you do talk about labor, and at the intersection of labor is disability studies, because of the colonial capitalist imperial lens on which we think about plants as doing something, or how amazing that they move despite being, that the ways in which we think about value, like what sentient beings constitute value based on the labor that they do. And I found it an interesting reprieve to think through racial capitalism, through colonialism, and labor and extraction as the foregrounds, as opposed to capitalism, which one are we talking about, when and where? Its liveliness is, mutable. But I do think that at the core of it is notions of labor seen through through extraction and worthiness deemed through what you can do.
Okay, we have started a minute late, so I'm gonna, or a couple minutes late. Let's take one more. Two more questions then, because there were two hands up. No?
Back, so maybe not.
Okay, maybe there are two questions. I definitely have one over here. So.
Hi there. Thank you for a wonderful talk and a wonderful panel. My name is Kenneth Walker, and I work at I'm a project manager of a biocultural diversity project in the William and Linda Steer Herbarium of the New York Botanical Garden. So thinking about your books and herbariums, also I want to I want to thank you for also lifting Maria Lugones. I'm a Binghamton undergrad. Well, I graduated from Binghamton for my undergrad, and she was, prolific teacher there. And, thinking about feminism and modernity and also capitalism, all of these things, and power, going back even to Foucault, thinking about these institutions that we work in and power. So these are our spaces, botany and herbarium, we've stripped them of their people and of the cultural stories. And yet I work, at the same time in a project which is attempting to bridge that, to return some of these names, some of these stories, some of these peoples to these collections. But yet, thinking about gatekeeping, how these institutions, universities, botanical gardens, are organized to keep people out, to be exclusive, to create, sort of this othering. How do you recommend we go about this work, especially like in my area of ethnobotany? We're constantly thinking about how we can bridge without continuing these extractive logics, which ethnobotany was, explicitly based on economic botany and thinking about economic principles of plants and naming. So how can we, ethically start, doing some of these works in these spaces where it is most critical, but, thinking about Audre Lorde, we can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house.
That's such a great question and such a difficult one. I have very ambivalent feelings about herbaria. It's kind of a mortuary of plants, right? Is what they are. And you're right that there are so many layers to it. Some of it is about the ways in which there were plants that had rich, entangled histories with the people around. The people had many names for that plant, but then the colonists go there, they discover the plant for the first time, name it after the empress or some military figure or themselves sometimes, right? And so then in the botanical story, they become the discoverers of it, and you're right. And so one immediate thing is what you're doing, which is really important, is to bring back the other name, to again endow plants with these amazing multiple nature cultural relationships they have with people across the world, because sometimes the plant exists in many places, to call out the colonial histories of the naming practices, to call out the colonial histories where the majority of plants, the main type is held in the colonized countries, not in the countries in which they form. So there's so much about the repositories of herbaria, where they're located, who has access to it. So that's one level at which I think those structures of power, we need to interrogate them and redo it. But I'm also interested in that larger question of what does it mean, of the idea behind herbaria, of taking a living plant, pulling it out of the ground, drying it, positioning it in some way, on a sheet of paper, and then that becomes that prototype that will mark a whole species. And I think these whole ideas of what individuals are, what species are, these are all also part of ideas within botany, when in fact different individuals of a species do very, very different things. And I think increasingly, we are finding things we didn't know before. So when you take one particular individual and you say, this is what that species is, sometimes that variability gets erased. And so there's a way in which the herbarium becomes this, I don't know, master sheet that characterizes variation in a very limited way, when in fact plants do lots of different things. So for me, I feel I want to rethink the idea of the herbarium as the site of naming, as the site of that perfect specimen that we will compare everything to in order to be able to name and characterize it. But I'm still on my way to thinking, and I would love to have more conversations with you on, I think there's so much that we need to rethink about the herbarium.
If I may, really quickly, it's a very complicated. Sort of a very complicated position to be in within an institution when, Nathaniel Lord Britton has his name, for instance, on the saguaro cactus. And he's named the saguaro cactus after, Carnegie or after, some other rich funder. And in that vein, also the type specimen is explicitly linked to Nathaniel Lord Britton, who proposed it, the American Code or the Rochester Code, before it was introduced and accepted into the major taxonomic codes. And so we have this sort of, thinking about founderism in, social, in history. We have to not play, but, we're constantly taught to hold these people in the highest light in our professional talks, in our dealing with funders, and our dealing with the public, but yet they're also tied to these very what can be considered icky, but at the same time there are sometimes there are papers where Britain says, for instance, Flora Borinqueña for me is evidence of thinking a bit outside the box in that time, because Borinqueña in Britain's time, the national anthem of Puerto Rico, my grandmother would have been arrested for singing the words, but naming this book Flora Borinqueña acknowledged a people who had been, violently erased from the landscape and the history, and similarly, vocabulary from botany, thinking of a flower as perfect, a bisexual or a hermaphroditic flower as perfect, also arms us with this vocabulary that we can use in this radical way.
Yeah, I think that's a very beautiful place for us actually to end. If you want to say anything about that, otherwise, I think thank you everyone for participating. Thanks, please, to Banu Subramaniam and Natali Valdez. Thanks again to Fordham for hosting us here, and please join us for other events at BCRW. You can go to, and the books. Yes, we're going to put up a QR code right now to be able to buy books. The QR code, I think we're going to be able to have it on the screen, right? Or you can come over here and just take a picture. The books are $30. You're also cordially invited, but certainly not required, to make a donation to BCRW that will allow us to keep doing this kind of public event. And we appreciate so much all of you for coming.